And we're back. We are reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell, and we are at chapter 6. Though it was the custom of a bridegroom to come to her father's house for the bride, Hillel had long ago decided that when his daughter married, it would be under the light of Jerusalem, the city of her fathers and of her people, the city of Zion, the holy place of God and the temple. It was autumn again before Hillel ben Baruch took Sephora and Saul to Israel and to Jerusalem. And Hillel wept afresh that his beloved wife was not on this journey to take joy in her daughter, but must remain behind in her tomb. He had taken Deborah from her father's house, and never had she seen it again. And he reproached himself that he had delayed. He could not endure it that Deborah would not see her daughter's wedding garments, and her jewels, and the gifts of the bridegroom. Deborah's nephew Ezekiel had sent Sephora. He would stroke the girl's shining hair, so like his own, and gaze tenderly into her golden eyes, and he would sigh. Yesterday she had been but a babe. Now she was 15 years old and a woman. Tomorrow she would be a mother herself. Hillel endured the weight of time and sorrow on his shoulders, and he felt old and exhausted. They sailed from Tarsus on a warm and golden autumn day that Saul was assaulted by emotions and he could hardly control. Two unfathomable forces contended in him, both furious and contentious and denying, and he dared not examine them. He stood on the deck of the galleon and watched the fervid harbor recede and the multicolored city as furious, noisy, and busy as ever, and the traffic on the river with red and blue and green and white sails, and beyond the contorted scarlet barrier of the mountains which guarded the plains and the valley. The sun was passionate on the scene, giving it life and vitality and fervent movement, and the water was like yellow oil. Now the city became a medley of every color known to him, and the tiled roofs shimmered as if with fire, and the galleon carefully picked her way through the masted ships in the harbor, and her sails filled with hot wind, and stood like the great white wings of birds against the ardent blue of the sky. Saul could smell warm resin and the tar and hemp and heated wood and salt, and the deck dipped and rose beneath his feet. It was strange to him. He had never left Tarsus before, and he tried to fix his mind on the novelty and perceive it, but the emotions that tore him like two-fanged tigers would not let him go. His father and Sephora reclined under an awning on the deck, listlessly ate fruit, feeling sadness that Deborah was not with them, and nearby sat Sephora's two maidens who would live with her in her husband's house and serve her. But Hillel, the simple man, had no servant with him. There was gray mingled in his golden hair and beard, for he was now nearly 47, and sorrow had taken the brilliance from his eyes and had dimmed his flesh. But he smiled at his daughter and sighed. A maiden needed her mother at this time of her life, to counsel her and advise her and admonish her. But Sephora had no mother. The family of Hillel ben Baruch were to be guests in the house of David ben Shabuah, and David's wife was a Roman matron who had been described to Hillel as an old Roman, and not a licentious and worldly woman of modern society. She was so virtuous a woman, and of so distinguished and ancient a Roman house, that she was also extremely pious, and had instilled in her sons and daughters not only the principles and precepts of the old stern gods, but had insisted on their being given a rigid training in their father's abandoned religion. Her daughters were as discreet and modest and retiring as she had been in her girlhood, and were trained to Jewish duties and reverence as an old Roman. Clodia was courteous to her husband and her husband's family, for all she was of the gens Cornelius. Her sons had been circumcised. They meticulously observed the Jewish holidays because of their mother's severe insistence, though they smiled at her behind her strong square back. However, Clodia was respected and more than a little feared, and of this Hillel had heard and had few doubts, but that Clodia would impart to Sephora the secrets and the exhortations necessary for a bride. Hillel had been informed by other relatives that Clodia resembled a stalwart peasant woman from the fields of the Champagne rather than a great Roman lady whose kinsmen were honored by, rather than honoring the new Caesar, Tiberius Claudius Nero, in that monstrous and distant city of Rome. Her father and her brothers had served in his campaigns and had been famous for valor, and her family arms and the shields of her warriors hung on the walls of David ben Shabua's house in Jerusalem. My wife, David ben Shabua had written, somewhat ruefully, can at times be considered handsome, though never beautiful. She is frugal and stern, but kind and just, and should have made an excellent wife for one of the old patriarchs. She guards my purse, which I find a little onerous, but I know her of her excellent investments and her large properties. Reserved and quiet though my Clodia is, rarely speaking in the presence of men, I have heard that in Rome she is the terror of bankers and stockbrokers. Her accounts would awe a money-lender, so correct are they. She visits the court of the Gentiles on the holy days, as sedulously as she visits and sacrifices to her favorite divinity, Juno, of the harsh temper and the ever-seeing eyes. Doubtless she considers me another Jupiter. Her domestic gifts are superb. Her table is valued by Herod himself, the tetrarch, not to mention my Greek friends of the delicate palate and my Roman friends who admire her exotic cooks. Clodia is no provincial. You will notice I speak of Clodia's cooks, not mine, for she considers her domain sacred, and not to be invaded by husbands. We have a cook of Greek talent, and an Egyptian cook who prepares dishes to make a Syrian envious, and most certainly a Jewish cook. To the amusement of many, my Clodia obeys the dietary laws of the Jews. Hillel had always been a little incredulous about this, discovering it hard to imagine a great and noble Roman lady governing her kitchen in a strange land among strangers, not of her race and religion, and deferring dutifully to what she considered to be her husband's duty, and managing her household not as a Roman, but as a lady of Israel. But then, he would reflect, the Romans resemble us, Jews, very mysteriously. He had also heard that Clodia regarded Greeks and Sadducees with a disapproving eye, which Hillel would think with a smile must cause the elegant David some disagreeable moments and some embarrassment, as well as the jest of his family and his friends. But Hillel recalled the words of Ruth, "Thy people shall be my people, thy God my God." Clodia had probably never heard of Ruth, but she had exemplified her. Clodia, therefore, was a redoubtable lady, and while the family of Shabua ben Abraham affected to find her amusing and rallied David on his wife, they respected and feared her. Even her father-in-law, the aging urbane Shabua, deferred to her, and the wives of David's brothers were timid before this righteous and determined matron. Deborah, who had first seen Clodia when she, Deborah, had been a child, had often declared that the Roman lady was gross and with a heavy hand, more fitted to the field than to a cultivated house, and resembled a servant. So Hillel was heartened. He thought that he would find Clodia very similar to his dead and beloved grandmother, Sarah, but he wondered with some uneasiness if Sephora, who had been reared freely and lightly by her mother, could accustom herself to rarely appearing before men, never dining with them, and secluding herself in the women's quarters over which Clodia was the rigorous queen. He had tried to tell the girl of her aunt, and Sephora, who had heard much from her mother, was laughingly dismayed. A veritable Gorgon, she had said. Let us speak of a mother of Israel, Hillel had replied. Father and daughter had then looked at each other and had laughed a little. It was Saul who had listened with approval of Clodia, and in some way Hillel had felt this a deprecation of Deborah. Yet Hillel was relieved. In many ways, Saul was more the son of a Clodia than of a Deborah, and even perhaps of a Hillel ben Baruch. During the past year, he had become even more so. Hillel now watched Saul, who was leaning on the rail of the ship, looking back at Tarsus, become in the hot noonlight a broken welter of color on the water, surmounted by those terrible mountains. The youth's chin was already faintly red with his growing beard. His crest of red hair appeared still virile and arrogant, and his ears were enormous. His profile was set and unrelenting with his thoughts, the big nose arching from his face, his chin hard and fixed, his mouth a straight and somber line. His former high color had left him. He seemed less sturdy, but taller and thinner. Yet his indomitable air had strangely increased with his decline of physical vitality, and if his body were more slender, his shoulders appeared wider and more manly. His legs were still deplorable, but lately he had given up the short tunic and wore a robe to his ankles, a brown linen robe with a girdle of dull worked silver, covered by a cloak of the same unpleasant color. But for his remarkable face would have seemed to be a son of somewhat unprosperous merchant, simple and plain and unpretentious, bent on securing as much money as possible for goods now in the hold of the ship. He would hardly impress his aristocratic kinsman in Jerusalem, though doubtless Clodia would admire him. There had never been much communication between Hillel and his son, though Hillel had helplessly struggled to draw closer to Saul from his childhood. He knew that Saul loved him, and he also knew that Saul did not place much value on his mind, and did not approve of his rare but telling and amusing jests about the more fanatic of the Pharisees. Saul, Hillel was afraid, was really indulging his father when he listened with silent respect to his homilies and little parables and his explanations of some obscure paragraph in the Scriptures. Saul, Hillel was sadly sure, had already reached a more subtle and learned conclusion, which was possibly correct and not diffused as in Hillel's fashion. In short, Saul was the complete and unbending Pharisee, and Hillel unjustly blamed Reb Isaac for this, and accused himself of not being tolerant and emphatic enough in his own teachings of his son. Hillel sighed again. There was not a fingerful of humor in Saul, except for an occasional ironic comment or some sardonic remark, and these had become more marked and frequent during the past year. The portents of his infanthood were manifesting themselves inexorably. The old occasional tenderness, the old young impulsiveness, the old artless loud laughter of boyhood, had left Saul a year ago, not slowly, not through illness, but in a moment. He could still speak vociferously and dogmatically, but no longer did his smile offer half an apology or amusement at himself. When Saul spoke now, he did not invite argument or disagreement, not even from his father. Only Aristo could make him flush when disputing with him. But now anger would light up those peculiar and compelling eyes. Surely Saul did not think himself infallible. No, thought Hillel, still watching his son, he does not believe himself infallible, but he thinks himself superior to other men in judgment and understanding of the Word of God, and the precepts of the prophets and the patriarchs. A Pharisee indeed, unrelenting, unyielding, even ruthless, in defense of the Holy One of Israel, the guardian of the book. He talked of the Messiah on every occasion, dismissing all other conversation as irrelevant and time-destroying, and therefore sinful and debasing. Sometimes, Hillel felt weary. Hillel, therefore, was anticipating Jerusalem, with its Romans and Greeks and many other races, its teeming cosmopolitan civilization, its many diversities in faces and manners and customs, with a relief he would have believed incredible only a year ago. Saul would be an anachronism in that lively, colorful society, and Hillel was not displeased. He felt a little guilty when he hoped that in some way, Saul would not encounter numerous other Pharisees, but it was possible that even Pharisees in Jerusalem had mellowed a little. Saul was young, and the young were susceptible, and Hillel hoped that one day soon the younger Saul would return, eager with life, ready with a jest, boisterous with laughter, testing his sister, and curious and tireless. Saul lifted himself from the rail of the deck and slowly turned and faced his father and sister. "Come join us for wine and fruit, my son," Hillel said, and made room for Saul on the couch on which he sat. The ship creaked and heeled, and other passengers conversed loudly, and there was tramping below and runnings up and down the stairs, and the mighty sails seemed to be attempting to lift the ship into the sky. A group of young Roman legionnaires stood at a distance, drinking, exchanging rollicking and obscene jests, and swaggering where they stood, clanking their iron-shod feet, and furtively eyeing the beautiful Sephora. Saul saw this, and he suddenly gave the soldiers a fierce and despising look. They were astonished. They were only lads, and they had been admiring a delectable young lady who had not shown any displeasure. Their mouths fell open. They were insulted by this plainly clad and insignificant youth with his flaring red hair. They clanged their feet harder on the wooden deck. One or two even touched their swords, and they frowned forbiddingly. They were Romans. They were masters of the world. How dared a miserable man from Tarsus resent their conversation or their laughter and favor them with a look which consigned them to the status of the market rabble and slaves? Then Saul turned from them and went to his father and sister. Sephora was half reclining on the soft divan, very conscious of the glances she had evoked from those boys. She wore a chiton of blue silk, artfully embroidered in gold and silver, and her smooth white arms were bare, as was her throat, and her veil was like a mist over her golden hair. And there were jewels at her neck and on her arms, and her hands and her feet were shod with scarlet slippers. Her golden eyes glistened, and her lips were like red rubies, and her pretty nose was warm ivory, and she had assumed an air of worldly languor. Perfume rose from her, and Saul was suddenly reminded of the scent of crushed flowers and grass on which he and Dassel had lain. Torment seized him. "You resemble a harlot, my sister," he said through his teeth. "There is kohl about your eyes and a paint pot on your mouth. Your arms are naked and shameless, and your ankles are exposed. Where is your modesty, your decorum?" Never before had he spoken in such a tone and in such words to his once beloved Sephora. The girl paled and shrank. The Roman soldiers listened, even more astonished. Then Hillel sat upright, and for the first time Saul saw his father deeply angered against him and outraged. The brown eyes became hard and daunting. "Saul," said Hillel, "depart from us until you have prepared an apology. We will dine alone." He still stared harshly at his son. It is said that he who insults another in public without provocation incurs the wrath of God. Meditate on that while you eat your solitary meal. For the first time in his life, Saul did not bow before his father's rebuke. Instead, he gazed at his father with so implacable a face, with such cold and formidable eyes, that Hillel was horrified and stricken. It was a stranger who confronted him, and not his son. The stranger was not of his spirit. Then Saul inclined his head, turned on his heel, and left his father. He went down the stairs to the room he shared with Hillel. Hillel watched him go, and the sorrow became desolate in his eyes. "Father," said Sephora, seeing this, "Saul is guiltless of offense. He spoke from some misery in his soul. I have discerned this for over a year. His illness devastated him." Hillel touched her soft little hand. He said, "No, the change appeared before his illness, before your mother's death. May God rest her soul. He is possessed, but of what he is possessed I do not know, and I have no pathway to his mind, and he bars the way." And we're going to stop there. That will be part 1, and we'll begin again with chapter 6, part 2, momentarily.